had always liked hiking alone. It wasn't because I didn't enjoy company. I just liked silence more. Out in the hills or the desert or up in the woods, there's something about hearing only your breath, the crunch of your boots, the wind pushing through dry grass. There was nothing to explain, nothing to think about except the next step, the next bend, the next climb. That kind of peace was hard to find anywhere else. I had taken time off work, just a week, nothing big. The plan was simple: 3 days out in the southern Utah canyons, near a lesser-known trail system that cut through a long dry valley and wound down into a maze of red rock. There were slot canyons, dry creeks, and old animal trails that people didn't use much anymore. I had read about it in a hiker's forum. Nothing too dangerous, just long, dry, and very isolated. Perfect. I left my car at a small gravel pullout just off a backcountry road. No marked trailhead, no park ranger station, just a barbed wire fence and a faint track leading into the brush. I had a printed topographic map, a compass, and a GPS that still had battery. I packed light but enough to get through 4 days if I had to. Tent, sleeping bag, 2 liters of water to start, water filter, dried food, light stove, first aid kit. I always double-checked everything. The first day was beautiful. It was hot, dry, but not unbearable. The landscape rolled and dipped in quiet, dusty colors. Orange, tan, light brown rock formations like something from a painting. Cactus here and there, short, twisted trees that barely looked alive. I didn't see another person all day. I made it about 12 miles in before I stopped to make camp in a flat spot beneath a wide sandstone overhang. It kept the evening sun off me while I boiled water and ate a small meal. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the darkening sky as stars started to pop out one by one. No wind, no bugs, no animals. Just quiet. The second day started the same. I got up with the sun and started moving before it got too hot. I followed the dry creek bed as it narrowed into the mouth of a canyon. The walls got steeper, closer. It wasn't a slot canyon yet, but it was heading that way. I checked the map. Everything was where it should be. My route showed a series of tight turns through these canyons that would loop around and eventually open up onto a high ridge. From there, I'd follow the ridge another 10 miles and then drop down to a different part of the same dry valley. It was supposed to be a loop. By mid-afternoon, the walls were so close I could touch both sides if I stretched my arms out. The ground was uneven now, rocks, dry sand, spots that looked like they might flash flood if a storm ever rolled in. There weren't any clouds. Still, I kept my pace steady, always aware of the narrowing rock around me. Some sections were tough to get through, squeezing sideways with my pack above my head, careful not to slip and twist something on the rough stone. Then it started getting strange. Not supernatural, just off. I remember stopping at a narrow bend, looking down at the ground and seeing something that didn't fit. A crushed plastic water bottle, old but not ancient, maybe a couple months. It was jammed between 2 rocks like it had been dropped and then stepped on. That didn't bother me at first. Other people had clearly been here before, but the thing was, this trail was rarely used. According to the forums, the canyon had barely seen anyone in years. Most hikers avoided it because of the narrow terrain and the risk of getting trapped in case of rain. I kept going, thinking maybe someone had tried the loop before me. Maybe they'd left trash by accident. But an hour later, I saw more signs. A torn strap from a backpack, a metal zipper, even a cracked GPS unit with its screen shattered and battery missing. It was like someone had dropped pieces of gear one by one, then vanished. I stood there for a while, holding that broken GPS. I turned it over in my hand, staring at the scratch marks on the plastic. It looked like it had hit something hard. I stuffed it in a side pocket on my own pack. I figured I'd toss it out later. I kept going, but I felt different now, more alert, more aware of every echo, every sound of loose gravel. The narrow rock made it hard to tell where sounds came from. Everything bounced around. I started hearing little things, soft clicks, tiny falls of dust and sand from above. Maybe animals, maybe just wind. But there was no wind. Later that day, the slot canyon widened for a bit and opened into a small flat basin with low shrubs and a few scattered boulders. I decided to stop there for the night. Even though I hadn't gone as far as I wanted, the place felt better, more open. I set up my tent against a big rock and sat down to eat. As I boiled water, I noticed something weird about one of the rocks on the far side of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then I saw that it was actually a small hole, like a crack in the rock wall, about the size of a doorway. It didn't look natural. It was too square. I finished eating, packed up my food waste in a sealed bag, and walked over to the opening. I looked inside. It was shallow, just a few feet deep, enough to crawl into like a hiding spot. There were bones in it, animal bones, maybe a coyote or something smaller, all picked clean, nothing else. No fur, no gear, no sign of people. I stepped back, stared at the hole for a long time, then turned around and went back to my tent. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, listening, the kind of half-sleep where every noise feels louder than it should. The third day is where everything went wrong. I started early again. The plan was to get through the next section of the canyon and start the climb toward the ridge by late afternoon. I wanted to be in the open before dark. The map showed the canyon getting tighter for another couple of miles, then a series of switchbacks that went almost straight up the rock wall to a high overlook. I entered the next section of canyon. The rock walls now were tall, at least 60 feet on either side. Narrower, too. Felt more like a tunnel than a canyon. Sunlight barely reached the bottom. The air felt cooler. The ground was packed sand, dry and soft. I followed it for a mile before I found the first sign of real danger. Pile of rocks. Not natural. Someone had stacked them. Cairn, but not a marker. This one was odd, more like a warning. It was shaped like an arrow pointing back the way I came. On top of it, someone had placed a red bandana tied around a stick. The fabric was old, sun-bleached. I stopped, looked at the bandana, the stack of rocks. I didn't move for several minutes. Then I made a mistake. I ignored it. I told myself it was probably left by someone who got spooked. Maybe they turned around and wanted to mark the spot for others. Maybe they just panicked. I didn't want to be that person. I kept going. Another hour in, the trail vanished. I'm not saying it faded. I mean, it just stopped. 1 minute I was walking through the canyon. The next I was facing a wall of rock. The GPS wasn't helpful. The signal bounced. My map said I should be able to keep going, but the real world didn't agree. I turned in circles, checked every crack, every small passage. There was no way forward. Either the canyon had collapsed or the route had changed. I turned around, already uneasy. As I retraced my steps, something felt wrong. I passed by a rock I didn't remember, a bend that was facing the wrong way. I pulled out the compass. It didn't make sense. I was going east instead of west. Somehow, I had looped or twisted around and didn't notice. The canyon walls made it impossible to see the sun. That's when I started to feel watched. I kept hearing sounds behind me, like soft scraping, small rocks shifting. I stopped and stood still, holding my breath, but the sounds would stop too. Every time, I walked faster, heart pounding. I didn't want to run, not in that tight space. One wrong step and I could twist an ankle or worse. But something was back there. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I knew. Then I heard it, clear and real this time. A footstep, not an animal, not wind. A step, heavy, deliberate. I turned fast. Nothing, just the bend I had come around. I stared for 10 minutes straight, not blinking, just waiting. Then I started moving again. I turned corners at full speed now, not even caring if I made noise. I needed to get back to the last place I recognized. I needed to see the sun again. Eventually, the canyon opened a little, enough to see a slice of sky. I checked the map again, realized I had somehow moved east again. I was off course, far off. I wasn't even in the right canyon. I had wandered into a side route that didn't show up on the map. Probably one of the dozens of offshoots that look the same but go nowhere. Dead ends. I was officially lost. I had just under a liter of water left. I hadn't found a refill point all day. No creeks. Nothing but dry dust. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd seen animal tracks. The land felt empty, like something had scared everything away. I sat down under an outcropping to get out of the sun. That's when I saw it. Way up, almost hidden behind a ledge, was I don't usually go hiking alone, but I had been feeling off for a few weeks, kind of numb and irritated with everything. I felt like my life had been stuck on repeat, like I woke up each day to the same things, same screens, same noises, same pointless scrolling. So when I found a long weekend coming up, I decided to go hiking deep into the hills, away from all of it. I packed light but smart, trail shoes, my old but solid backpack, a tarp for shelter, a sleeping bag, my cheap camp stove, and enough food and water filters to last me 3 days. I picked an area I had never been to, a forest region about 4 hours from my place, not too far from the state border. I had seen people post photos from there online, but it didn't seem overrun with tourists. There was a loop trail that ran about 20 miles, and it looked isolated enough to give me that quiet I was looking for. I drove out early on Friday morning. The road to the trailhead was old and cracked in places, with only a small gravel lot where I could park. There were no rangers, no fee booths, just a wooden sign nailed crooked to a post. No other cars were there when I arrived. The forest around the trailhead was thick and dark in a beautiful way. Tall trees with deep green leaves, a lot of shadows, birds calling in the distance, and the cool kind of stillness that city people forget exists. I set out a little after 9 a.m. The trail began gently enough, winding through a pine-heavy patch of woods. The dirt was soft but dry. I could hear my own footsteps clearly, and every now and then I stopped just to listen. Not for anything in particular, but to really hear the forest. The air was cool and damp, and I could smell moss and old wood. It felt good to finally unplug. The first part of the hike went smoothly. I kept a steady pace, stopping every now and then to take a sip of water or sit on a rock. I had planned to cover about 8 miles the first day and set up camp near a small creek I'd seen on the map. I didn't see a single person all morning. At one point, I found an old rusted can near the side of the trail and wondered how long it had been there. It looked like it belonged to the 1980s. Around noon, I came across a fork in the trail that I hadn't expected. One path continued in the direction my GPS said I should go. The other veered slightly downhill and looked overgrown. But there was a wooden marker pointing in that direction, though the letters were almost impossible to read. I stood there a while, checking my map and phone. I had bars, but the signal was weak. I zoomed in and realized the downhill path was a short alternate route that connected to the main loop. It looked like it would cut about half a mile off. I figured why not? I wasn't in a rush, but I also didn't feel like sticking to the main trail the entire time. So I took the downhill path. It narrowed quickly, and I had to duck under a few low branches. There were no boot prints on the ground, just scattered pine needles and the occasional deer hoof print. After about 20 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the lack of wind. The trees were completely still, and I hadn't heard a bird in several minutes. It was that thick kind of silence that makes your skin crawl a bit. But I kept walking. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Sometimes isolation does that to your head. Then I came across something strange. The trail dipped and curved around a large boulder, and sitting next to it was a pile of rocks, about waist high, stacked too neatly to be natural. There was no marker on it, no plaque, nothing. It wasn't shaped like a cairn hikers use to mark trails. It looked more like a crude monument. I walked around it once and kept going. About 20 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen the trail reconnect to the main loop. I checked my phone again. The signal was gone. GPS wasn't loading. The trail was thinner now, barely a trail at all, just broken ground that looked like it had been walked on once or twice, a long time ago. I stopped and thought about going back the way I came, but something in me wanted to believe it would all connect soon. I kept walking. Another 30 minutes went by. Still no sign of the main trail. My legs were starting to ache, and the sun was getting low enough to change the color of the light. I told myself I'd go another 10 minutes, and if nothing changed, I'd turn around. But just then, I saw something ahead. A structure. It was a small shack, old, beaten up, barely standing. Its roof sagged, and the wooden walls were warped from years of weather. There was no door, just a dark opening. No windows either, The ground around it was flat and clear, as if someone had once maintained the area but hadn't touched it in decades. I felt drawn to it, though I didn't want to go inside. I circled it once and saw that on the backside, nailed into the wall, were 3 old hooks. Like meat hooks, they were rusted and bent slightly, but still holding strong. Below them was a dark stain on the wood, almost black. I backed away. I walked another 50 yards past the shack and saw that the trail completely vanished. It didn't curve or split, it just ended, like it had never been a trail at all, just an illusion of one. I stood there staring at the forest ahead. No path, no signs, no footprints, just thick woods and brush and trees too close together to walk through. I knew I had made a mistake. I turned back, but somehow the way back didn't look the same. I walked for over half an hour, retracing my steps, but I didn't pass the shack again. I didn't even pass the strange pile of rocks. Everything felt slightly different, like I was walking in a mirrored version of the same place. Familiar but wrong. By the time I accepted that I was lost, the sun was dropping fast. I stopped in a small clearing, pulled out my tarp and sleeping bag, and set up camp. I wasn't in full panic yet. I had enough gear, food, and water, but I couldn't get that shack out of my head. The hooks, the stain. I barely slept that night. The forest was too quiet, and every snap of a twig made my heart beat faster. At one point, I thought I heard something moving near my tarp, but when I peeked out, I saw nothing. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. The next morning, I packed up fast and started walking in the direction I thought would lead me back. My plan was to bushwhack northeast until I either hit the main trail or found the stream that ran near it. I had my compass and map, but without clear markers, I was guessing more than navigating. The second day was worse. The terrain got rougher. Thorns tore at my arms. I slipped twice crossing a mossy slope and bruised my hip. I ran into a patch of ground that was almost swampy and had to backtrack. I drank more water than I should have. The sky was overcast, which made it hard to tell time or direction by the sun. Around noon, I heard something behind me. At first it sounded like a twig snapping, then leaves crunching. I stopped and looked back. Nothing, but the feeling in my chest got tight, like I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, trying not to look over my shoulder too much. I felt eyes on me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I made a small fire, even though I didn't want to. I needed the warmth and maybe the light. I sat with my back to a tree, staring into the dark. At one point, I thought I saw something move between the trees. I froze, gripping my knife, but nothing came out. When the third day started, I was out of calm. I was moving on instinct, trying not to fall apart. My food was low. I hadn't seen a proper trail in almost 2 days. Every tree looked the same. My socks were soaked, and my boots had started to rub my heels raw. I was bleeding through the back of both socks. That afternoon, I finally saw something man-made.
A rusty barbed wire fence.
It stretched in both directions, disappearing into the trees. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a property or road. After nearly an hour, I saw a break in the wire, a narrow gate hanging off its hinges. I squeezed through and kept going. A mile or so later, I came across an old dirt road. My legs almost gave out when I saw tire tracks in the mud. I followed it for what felt like hours, until I heard the sound of a truck. I practically threw myself into the middle of the road to wave it down. It was a local man in an old red pickup. He was suspicious at first, but when he saw the state I was in, my clothes torn, face sunburned, lips cracked, he let me in and drove me to the nearest small town, which was over an hour away. At the little sheriff's office, I tried to explain what happened. They nodded, took notes, but didn't seem surprised. One of the older deputies said people had gotten lost out there before, especially those who went off-trail. He mentioned an old hunting shack deep in the woods, long abandoned. He said the hooks were probably from the days when they skinned deer on sight. I asked him why that alternate trail was marked if it didn't lead anywhere. He said it wasn't. That whole fork wasn't official. Someone probably made that marker years ago and left it. I asked how often people got lost in that area. He just shrugged. I stayed in a motel that night, ate 2 burgers, and fell asleep with the light on. I didn't dream. Even now, months later, I think about it. Not the getting lost part. Not even the shack. I never used to think twice about hiking alone. I grew up surrounded by woods in northern Arizona. By the time I was 15, I was already spending weekends out in the forest by myself, following deer trails and dry creek beds until I was miles from anywhere. I learned how to read maps early, knew how to follow the sun and use landmarks to stay oriented. I never once thought of myself as someone who could get lost. I had planned a 5-day solo hiking trip in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. I was going to start at a well-marked trailhead just outside Silverton and make a loop that would bring me back to my truck. It was about 40 miles in total, and I figured I could do it easily over 5 days with plenty of time to rest, set up camp, and maybe fish in a few of the alpine lakes. I had a detailed topographic map, a compass, and even a backup GPS device. I had all the gear I needed: tent, sleeping bag, a water filter, food for 7 days, and a bear canister. I told my sister exactly where I'd be, left her a copy of my map, and told her to call for help if she didn't hear from me by the 6th day. The first day went perfectly. The trail was in good condition, and the weather was clear, dry, and warm, but not hot. I hiked steadily for most of the day and reached my planned campsite near a lake just before sunset. I set up my tent, filtered water, made a hot meal, and lay in my sleeping bag watching the last of the light fade behind the mountains. I felt totally at peace. The second day was when things started to go wrong. The morning was quiet. I packed up camp, checked my map, and kept walking. At some point around midday, I saw a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on my map. One side looked well used and curved uphill. The other was narrower, more overgrown, and dropped down into a shallow valley. I took the uphill trail, figuring it was the right way based on the topography I'd studied. But I must have misread the contour lines or misunderstood the orientation. I walked for hours without seeing another trail marker, and the landscape stopped matching what was on the map. Trees that shouldn't have been there started showing up, thick clusters of lodgepole pines that blocked the sun. I couldn't find the river that was supposed to run alongside the trail. The GPS device gave me a vague position but no trail overlay, and the compass kept telling me I was walking south when I was sure I should have been heading west. I tried not to panic. I decided to backtrack to where I'd seen the last known trail marker, but by then, the clouds had rolled in and the light started fading fast. I wasn't confident I could retrace my steps before dark. I didn't want to risk walking off-trail in low visibility, so I set up camp in a flat spot surrounded by trees, figuring I'd get my bearings in the morning and try again. That night, the wind picked up and it got cold. I lay in my sleeping bag with the hood cinched tight, listening to branches creak above me and the occasional sound of something moving through the underbrush. I tried to tell myself it was just small animals, maybe a marmot or a fox, but it kept me awake. The third day was when I realized I was lost. I packed up early and hiked back the way I thought I'd come, only to end up at another clearing that looked familiar but slightly different. Fewer rocks, a wider tree line. The trail seemed to split again in 2 or 3 directions, none of which made sense. I climbed up onto a ridge to try and spot a familiar landmark, but everything looked the same. Trees, hills, and the same distant mountains I couldn't quite place. I tried using the GPS to match my location to the topographic map, but without a trail overlay or reception, it was almost useless. I could have been anywhere within 10 square miles. I rationed my water carefully and used my filter to fill up from a stream I found near a meadow. I sat there for a long time trying to stay calm. I told myself I'd probably just gone off course a little, and if I kept heading west, I'd eventually intersect with the main trail. But it started raining in the late afternoon, and the rain turned into sleet. My boots were soaked, my socks squished with every step. I stopped early and pitched my tent in a grove of aspens. The ground was cold and soggy, and it was hard to sleep with the sound of rain hammering on the tent walls. On the 4th day, I was officially in survival mode. I didn't know which direction was the right one anymore. My legs ached from climbing and slipping. My hands were swollen and covered in cuts from pushing through brush. The trail, if you could still call it that, was a mess of mud and fallen branches. I had to stop often to rest, and each time I stopped, the panic grew. I had enough food to last 2 more days if I stretched it, but my energy was dropping fast. I'd barely eaten the day before. I was losing my appetite, which was a bad sign. I climbed another ridge, hoping again to get a view, and this time I saw something different. In the far distance, across a wide valley and up another slope, I saw what looked like a fire lookout tower. It was just a shape at first, a thin vertical line with a box on top, but it stood out from the trees. I focused on it for 10 minutes straight to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It didn't move. It was real. That became my goal. I marked the angle with my compass and started moving toward it. Took the rest of the day to get down into the valley. The brush was thicker than anything I'd moved through before. My pants tore on a sharp branch. My boots slipped on mossy rocks. I crossed the stream again, and this time I fell in up to my waist. I pulled myself out, drenched and shaking, and forced myself to keep moving. I didn't want to stop. I felt like if I rested too long, I might not get up again. I made it to a dry patch under a spruce tree and set up my tent just as it started to get dark. I didn't eat that night. I just lay in my wet clothes inside my sleeping bag and stared at the roof of the tent, thinking about that tower and how far it still looked. I figured I had 1 more day of food, maybe 2 if I skipped breakfast and lunch. On the 5th day, I woke up early, sore and cold. My muscles felt locked. I forced myself to move. I broke down camp quickly, choked down a granola bar, and started climbing again toward where I thought the tower was. I couldn't see it anymore. Too many trees, but I trusted my compass and my memory. I followed deer trails where I could, crawled over boulders when I had to, and pushed through wet branches that slapped me in the face and soaked my shirt. My hands went numb from the cold. My lips cracked. I started coughing, a dry, shallow cough that wouldn't stop. By midday, I finally crested a hill and saw it again. Closer now, clearly a lookout tower, weathered but still standing. It was another mile, maybe more, but I had a straight line to it now. That gave me a burst of energy. I stumbled downhill, rolled my ankle once but kept going, and didn't stop until I reached the base of the tower around sunset. It was abandoned. The door at the bottom was hanging open, swinging in the wind. Inside, there were old supplies, cans of food too rusted to open, a broken radio, and a cot with a rotting mattress. But the view from the top gave me everything I needed. I could see the winding river in the valley below. I could see a road, just a thin gray line, but it was real, and I knew if I could reach that road, I'd make it out. I stayed in the tower that night. I used the broken cot frame to hang my wet clothes and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, shivering through the night. I didn't sleep much. I just waited for daylight, counting the seconds in my head. The 6th day, I left at first light and hiked down the slope toward the river. I was slow, weak, and dehydrated, but I kept putting one foot in front of the other. I followed the water downstream until I reached a narrow dirt road. I sat on the gravel shoulder and waited, hoping a car would come. It was hours before a ranger drove by. He stopped, got out, and looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was real. I could barely speak. I just nodded when he asked if I needed help. He drove me straight to the ranger station. I had lost 20 pounds. My skin was sunburnt and raw. My boots had peeled apart at the soles. I had a mild case of hypothermia and a lung infection from breathing in too much cold air. They called my sister. She cried on the phone. I just sat there and sipped hot broth until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I don't really know why I decided to go hiking alone that week. I had time off work, and I'd already told myself I wouldn't waste it sitting in my apartment. I had a list of places I wanted to hike, mostly trails I'd read about online. Ones people said were quiet and less crowded. That's what I wanted, quiet. I didn't care much for big popular trails where you keep running into people every 5 minutes. I wanted nature, time to think, and to push myself a little. The place I picked was called Broken Ridge. It wasn't well known. I found it on a forum where some people talked about lesser-used trails in the northern parts of the state. One guy mentioned that it had amazing views and he'd done it twice, but said it wasn't maintained anymore and there were a few steep climbs. That didn't bother me. I've hiked plenty before. I figured I'd be careful and stick to the trail as best I could. I packed light, but not too light. 2 liters of water, a water filter in case I needed more, a few energy bars, trail mix, a knife, my phone with a downloaded offline map, a printed topographic map, and a light first aid kit. I had a cheap compass too, even though I wasn't expecting to go off-trail. Weather was supposed to be cool, partly cloudy, no rain. I had decent boots, a light jacket, and I left a note on my kitchen table just in case something happened. Something I always do when I go out alone. I said I'd be back by the next evening. I drove out early, left around 6 a.m. The trailhead was about 3.5 hours away. When I got there, it was already past 9:30. The area wasn't marked well. The parking space was just a small gravel pull-off next to a bend in the road. No signs, no map, no facilities. I found what looked like the trail and started up. It started out nice. Pine trees, light underbrush, a bit of an uphill but nothing serious. I could hear birds and wind. No sounds of people, no distant roads. I liked that. About 30 minutes in, the trail narrowed and started climbing steeper. I came across an old wooden post with no sign left on it. Maybe there had been a marker once, but it had either rotted off or someone took it. That should have been the first sign to turn around. But I kept going. The ground got rockier after that. Small loose stones made it easy to slip if I wasn't careful. Still, the scenery was great, deep green valleys to the side, and the higher I got, the more I could see through the gaps in the trees. I started sweating, took my jacket off and tied it to my bag. The trail dipped into a shaded part where the air was cooler. I stopped for water and had some trail mix. Still no one around. I kind of liked the idea that no one else would be up there all day. About 2 hours in, I reached what I thought was the halfway point. The trail curved sharply along the edge of a slope, and I had to be careful not to misstep. There was no railing or barrier, just open drop. I took my time. Beyond that, the trail flattened a bit and entered a thicker patch of forest. The light changed. Less sky, more branches. It felt like late afternoon even though it was barely noon. I remember feeling weird about that. I kept walking. The path wasn't marked, but there were signs others had been through before. Flattened grass, worn roots, some old boot prints. I stepped over a fallen log and kept going. That's when I noticed something off. First, it was just a smell. Not strong, but unpleasant. Like something rotting. It didn't make sense. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. I looked around but didn't see anything. The smell didn't last long. It was like I walked through a small pocket of it and then it was gone. The forest got quieter. I mean, really quiet. The birds I'd heard earlier were gone. No wind. Even the trees weren't moving. It felt unnatural. But I told myself I was imagining things. I kept walking. After another 20 minutes, I came to a fork. That confused me. The map I downloaded didn't show any forks on this trail. Neither did the printed one. Both paths looked used, but one was narrower and overgrown. The other looked a bit wider and seemed to climb. I decided to take the wider one, thinking it was probably the right way. That was the wrong decision. The trail narrowed again after a few minutes. The dirt turned more to dry clay. The trees got thinner. Eventually, I came to an open area, almost like a plateau, flat and dusty with scattered low bushes. I stopped and looked around. I couldn't see the trail clearly anymore. It had sort of faded into the ground. I walked forward a bit, looking for where it picked up again. I didn't see anything that looked like a trail. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I opened the offline map. It showed my location, but I was slightly off from the trail line. I tried to reorient myself with the compass. I figured if I kept heading northwest, I'd eventually cross the trail again. I took a deep breath, tightened my pack, and kept walking. That's when I tripped. My boot caught on something, probably a root, and I fell hard onto my hands and knees. It knocked the wind out of me. When I got up, I saw a cut on my palm and a scrape on my leg. Nothing serious, but enough to sting. I sat down on a rock and cleaned the cut with water. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker, a footprint, or even a broken branch for a long time. I was off trail. I stayed calm. I told myself I'd backtrack. I retraced my steps for at least 10 minutes, but the terrain all looked the same. The bushes, the rocks, even the pattern of the trees. I started feeling like I was walking in circles. The sun started dropping lower. The shadows got longer. I stopped again, drank more water, and forced myself to think clearly. I took out the printed map and checked where I thought I was. I guessed I had veered northeast instead of northwest. If I kept walking downhill, I'd eventually hit the small stream that ran through the valley. From there, I could follow it down to where the road curved near the parking area. That was my new plan. I started down. It was slow. The slope was steeper than I expected, and the ground was loose. I slipped more than once. My legs started cramping. I checked my phone again, still no signal. It was now close to 4:30 p.m., and the sun would go down soon. I told myself I'd be out of the forest by 6. That clearly wasn't happening now. I kept pushing forward downhill through brush and over rocks, ducking under branches. I couldn't find the stream. I heard no water, saw no sign of moisture in the dirt, just dry sticks, fallen leaves, and sharp rocks. I started to panic a little. Then I heard something. Not water, not animals. Something like a metal sound, brief, sharp, like steel striking steel, came from far ahead. I froze. I waited. Nothing followed. I told myself it was probably a bird or a branch falling onto rock. But the way it sounded, it didn't belong. I kept moving more carefully now. The forest got denser again. Thicker trunks, less light. I could feel my shirt sticking to my back. My ankle twisted once when I stepped on a loose rock. I limped a little but kept going. That's when I saw the cabin. It was sudden. I pushed through some brush and there it was, small, dark, old, just sitting in a clearing like it had been forgotten. The wood was gray and weathered. The windows were broken. The roof sagged in the middle. There was no path leading to it, no sign of recent activity. I stood there staring at it. I didn't want to go near it. Everything in me said to stay back. But I was exhausted. I needed to rest. I needed to check my map again. Maybe look around from higher ground. I walked closer. The door was open slightly, just enough to see the inside was dark. I didn't go in. I sat on a flat rock near the front and took out my water. I only had half a liter left. I checked the compass again. North was behind me. That meant I had been walking in the wrong direction for over an hour. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched. I turned quickly. Nothing, just trees. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I noticed footprints. Near the edge of the cabin clearing, in the dirt, were boot prints. Not mine. Too large, too deep. They were fresh. The ground was dry and dusty, so they had to be recent. My heart started pounding. I looked around again, stood up slowly, and backed away from the cabin. I turned and started walking fast. Not running, just fast enough to get away. I didn't know where I was heading anymore. I just wanted to put distance between me and that place. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Not close, just faint, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stopped. The sound stopped. I moved again. The sound came back. I kept walking faster this time. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Every instinct told me not to. I don't know how long I walked. It was getting dark. I had no flashlight. My phone battery was down to 12%. I knew I couldn't hike through the night. I needed to stop somewhere safe. Eventually, I found a small rock outcrop. It had a narrow gap behind it, almost like a shallow cave. I crawled in and pulled some dead branches in front of the entrance. I turned my phone brightness all the way down and checked it again. No signal, no GPS. I waited there all night. Every sound. I don't know why I decided to hike alone that week. I had taken time off work months before and circled the dates on my calendar, knowing I needed a break. I had spent the last year buried in spreadsheets and company emails, barely stepping outside my apartment unless it was to get groceries or check the mail. My back ached all the time, and my eyes stayed red from staring at screens. I was tired of the city noise, the concrete, the crowds, the damn traffic. I needed to get away from it all. Just me, the woods, and the silence. I picked a remote area in the Four Corners region, somewhere around southeastern Utah, where the land was rough, dry, and full of canyons. I'd read online about a long backcountry trail that looped through a series of high ridges and narrow valleys. The route wasn't on many maps, and from what I could tell, most people avoided it because it was hard to reach. That's exactly what I wanted. No crowds,
No noise.
just open sky and rocky dirt trails. I packed light but careful. Tent, small stove, sleeping bag, 3 days worth of freeze-dried food, iodine tablets, 2 bottles of water, a refillable filter, a first aid kit, headlamp, spare batteries, utility knife, compass, map, lighter, and extra socks. I also brought a journal, not because I planned to write anything deep, but to log my route and steps. I liked the feeling of checking off each leg of the trail, each marker, each small progress made. I drove most of the day just to get to the trailhead. The road got worse the farther I went. Potholes, dust clouds, sharp turns along the edge of steep cliffs with no guardrails. It was almost sunset by the time I parked near a bend in the dirt road, where a faded wooden sign pointed to the beginning of the ridge trail. There were no other cars, no ranger station, just dry brush, red rock, and a sliver of sun dipping behind the canyon wall. I decided to sleep in the back of the car that night. It was too late to start hiking, and I didn't want to stumble off a ridge in the dark. I laid there staring at the cracked ceiling of the old SUV, listening to the wind and the faint rustling of dry grass outside. I didn't sleep much, mostly because of the silence. Out there, silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was too wide, too empty, like the world was holding its breath. The next morning, I got up before the sun. I packed my bag and tightened the straps, stretched my legs, drank a full bottle of water, and marked the time in my journal. 5:45 a.m. I stepped onto the trail and started walking. The path started easy, flat and dusty, winding gently between low sagebrush and scattered boulders. I could see the canyon ridge rising in the distance, like a massive stone wave frozen mid-crest. The ground crunched under my boots, and I liked the sound. It meant I wasn't in an office. I wasn't checking emails. I was finally somewhere real. By midday, I had climbed about 1,200 feet. The air was thinner up there, dry and sharp. I had to pace myself to keep from getting lightheaded. The trail narrowed as I reached the ridge line. One side dropped sharply into a wide canyon, with layers of red and orange rocks stacked like crumbling bookshelves. The other side sloped into jagged outcrops and dry gulches. There were no railings, no ropes, just the dusty edge and a whole lot of empty space. I stopped for lunch beneath a small overhang that offered a bit of shade. I made some instant coffee and ate one of the dehydrated meals, chicken and rice. The coffee was terrible and the food tasted like salty cardboard, but I was hungry, and it filled me up. I looked out over the canyon and watched 2 vultures circling high above. They didn't seem to be moving, just gliding in lazy loops. I marked my journal again. 12:38 p.m. Ridge trail. Wind from west. No sign of people. That night, I set up camp at a wide spot near a cluster of juniper trees. There was a little flat clearing surrounded by rocks, and I used a few to make a windbreak. I boiled water, made another meal, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent. I didn't start a fire. I didn't want to draw attention in case someone else was out there. I knew it was unlikely, but I'd read enough stories to be cautious. When you're alone that deep in the backcountry, it only takes one bad encounter to ruin everything. I fell asleep to the sound of wind tugging at the tent walls. It came in gusts, loud and sudden, then faded to nothing. I heard creaks and pops in the distance, probably tree limbs or rocks settling. Still, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something, but every time I poked my head out, there was only darkness. Day 2 started slower. My legs were sore and my back stiff from the rocky ground. I repacked my gear and followed the trail as it dipped into a narrow valley, then climbed again onto a second ridge that was steeper than the first. By early afternoon, the trail became harder to follow. The wind had erased parts of it, and some markers had fallen over or disappeared completely. I kept checking the map and compass to stay on course, but even then, the land was confusing. Everything looked the same in every direction. Red dirt, rock spires, patches of dry brush. It was sometime after 4 p.m. when I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were fresher and not where I had come from. They followed the trail ahead of me and veered slightly to the right, down a slope. They were boot prints, clearly human, but deeper than mine, as if the person was heavier or carrying more weight. They looked recent, maybe within the last few hours. I stared at them for a long time, trying to decide whether I felt better or worse knowing someone else was out here. I followed the trail a bit farther and saw something strange hanging from a low branch up ahead. It was a shirt, faded blue, torn at the collar, caught on a brittle juniper limb. It flapped in the wind like some kind of flag. I stood still and just stared at it. It didn't look new. The color was sun-bleached, and the fabric was stiff from dust. But it hadn't been there long. No sign of animal damage or heavy weathering. Someone had either lost it recently or left it there on purpose. That night, I couldn't find a good campsite. The ground was too rocky, and the slope too steep. I ended up making camp in a narrow gully, half sheltered between two boulders. I was uneasy the whole time. I kept thinking about the shirt and the tracks. I didn't like that I hadn't seen a single person, but suddenly there were signs of someone ahead of me.
No tent. No campsite.
Just odd leftovers. Around midnight, I heard something outside the tent. It wasn't the wind this time. It was softer, a kind of crunching, slow and heavy, like someone walking just beyond the rocks. I froze. My hand went straight to the knife I kept tucked near my bag. I didn't move. I just laid there, holding my breath. The steps stopped after a few minutes, or maybe I just stopped hearing them. I stayed awake until dawn. The third day, I was more tired than ever, but I pushed on. The trail became harder to follow again, and my feet ached with every step. I had blisters now, and one of them had popped overnight. It stung badly, but I wrapped it and kept walking. I didn't want to stay another night in that area. I reached a narrow pass around mid-afternoon. It was like a chute between two high rock walls, just wide enough for one person. The wind howled through it, creating this eerie, moaning sound that didn't stop. I hurried through, hoping to make it to the next valley before nightfall. That's when I saw the pack. It was lying in the dirt near a scrub bush, faded green, missing a strap, covered in dust. I walked up slowly and nudged it with my boot. It looked abandoned. I checked the side pockets. Empty. I opened the main pouch. A broken flashlight, a crushed protein bar, and an empty water bottle. No ID, no phone, no notes, nothing that said who it belonged to. That's when the panic started. Not loud or sudden, just this slow, creeping sense that something was wrong. Someone had come out here before me and left their shirt, their tracks, and now their gear. But I hadn't seen a soul. No messages carved in wood. No SOS signs. Nothing. Just a trail of discarded items and silence. I moved faster after that. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted out. I scanned the map again and again, looking for the fastest way back toward my car. There was a dry riverbed that cut southwest, and I figured if I followed it, I'd hit the road eventually. It would add another day of hiking, maybe more, but I didn't want to go back the way I came. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just found a flat spot and laid in my bag, too tired to eat, too wired to sleep. I stared up at the stars and felt like they were watching me. The wind had stopped completely.
No sounds.
No bugs. Not even the crunch of distant steps. That kind of silence didn't feel like peace. Felt like something was waiting. On the morning of the fourth day, I started following the riverbed. The sun was brutal, and I had very little water left. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. I didn't know why. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. By noon, I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in early October. The weather was starting to cool down, but it wasn't cold yet, and the trees in the higher elevations were changing color. I'd taken a few solo hikes before, but they were always on well-known trails where I'd pass at least a handful of people, and cell service wasn't totally gone. This time, I wanted to do something different. More remote, more challenging, and completely disconnected. I chose a section of national forest in western Montana, a few hours' drive from the nearest town. It was called Red Valley Wilderness, and it wasn't as popular as the larger national parks. There were trails, but some hadn't been maintained for years. I found one on an old hiking forum, a loop that went deep into the backcountry, climbed up to a ridge and circled back. About 27 miles total. Some comments said the trail markers were worn out and it could be hard to follow in places, but I thought I could handle that. I packed light but smart, enough food for 2 days, a sleeping bag, bivy sack, warm layers, water filter, basic first aid kit, a detailed topographic map, and my compass. I left a rough plan with my brother just in case. I parked at the trailhead at around 8 a.m. It was nothing more than a dirt pull-off near a broken wooden sign with faded lettering. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. The sky was gray and quiet, with no wind. I locked my car, strapped on my pack, and started walking. The first few miles weren't bad. The trail was overgrown in some parts, but the ground was packed down enough that I could tell where I was going. I didn't see another soul. Every now and then I'd find an old trail marker nailed to a tree, tilted or cracked with age. I followed a creek uphill for a while, then cut through a thicker patch of forest where fallen logs crisscrossed the trail. I stepped over them one by one, careful not to trip. As I got deeper in, things started to feel different. Not necessarily bad, just quiet. No birds, no wind, no animal sounds. Just the crunch of my boots and the rustle of dry brush. The trees were tall and thick, with narrow spaces between them. Every direction looked the same. I kept checking my map, watching for elevation changes and forks in the trail. By late afternoon, I reached a flat area near a small clearing where I planned to camp. It had a few large rocks, some downed trees, and a little dry creek bed that probably flowed with snowmelt in the spring. I set up my bivvy between 2 trees, filtered water from a nearby puddle, and ate a few handfuls of trail mix and jerky. It was too cold for bugs, which was a relief, and the clouds were thinning. As the sun dropped behind the trees, I crawled into my bag and lay still. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, it was a feeling. I opened my eyes and lay there, listening. My heart was beating harder than usual, but I didn't know why. The forest was dead quiet. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, or maybe a dream I didn't remember. But I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the inside of my bivvy sack, thinking about how far I was from anyone else. The next morning, I kept hiking. The trail was supposed to curve northwest and start climbing to the ridge. According to the map, I should hit a switchback that would wind upward along a slope. But I never found it. I walked for 2 hours and the trail kept going straight and flat. The trees didn't thin out. I stopped and checked my compass. I was headed almost due south. That didn't make sense. I backtracked until I found a place where the trail split, something I hadn't noticed earlier. One path was overgrown and angled uphill. The other continued straight. I must have missed the turn the first time. I took the uphill path, pushing through branches and stepping over rocks. It looked more like a game trail than a real hiking path. I followed it anyway. The incline was steep, and the dirt was loose. I kept slipping and catching myself. The trees were so close together that I could barely see more than 20 feet ahead. My legs were getting tired. Then the trail just stopped. It ended at a rock face, like a dead-end wall, covered in moss and roots. I turned around, confused. When I tried to go back, I couldn't find the path I'd just come up. I stood in one spot for almost a full minute, turning in slow circles, scanning the ground, the trees, everything. I knew I hadn't gone far off the trail. It should have been right there. I walked in small loops, trying to find the same broken branches I'd stepped through, the rock I'd sat on earlier, but nothing matched. I didn't panic right away. I figured I'd just lost the path and needed to move a bit farther downhill. I took out my compass and started walking northeast, trying to get back to where I thought the main trail was. But every slope looked the same, and the trees blurred together. I kept walking for another hour before I stopped again and sat on a log. That's when the fear really started to creep in. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I knew the general direction of the trail, but I hadn't seen a marker in a long time, and the terrain was getting harder to read. I pulled out the map again and tried to match landmarks, elevation, streams, ridges, but nothing around me matched what I saw on the paper. It felt like I was in a space between the mapped places, like I'd stepped into a crack that didn't exist on the chart. I kept walking, this time trying to head due north. The light was fading again. I was sweating under my jacket even though the air was cold. My legs hurt. My stomach was tight. I hadn't eaten much. I found a flat patch near some thick brush and set up my bivvy for a second night. I didn't feel like eating. I lay still in the dark, trying not to think. I woke up to the sound of something heavy moving in the brush. It was early morning, still dark, and I heard it clear. A slow crunching sound, like weight shifting on dry leaves. I held my breath. Whatever it wasn't running. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It moved for a while, then stopped, then moved again. I didn't unzip my bag. I didn't even move. I just waited until it was light enough to see and then packed up as fast as I could. I kept hiking in the same direction, hoping I'd run into the trail or a recognizable landmark. Anything. But I didn't. Instead, I found something else. It was a clearing, not a natural one, a man-made one. There were broken wooden posts sticking out of the ground in a wide circle, maybe 15 feet across. In the center, there was an old metal barrel, rusted out and half covered with pine needles. The ground around it was blackened, like it had been burned years ago. There were beer cans crushed flat, a ripped-up blue tarp tangled in the underbrush, and the remains of a rotted-out folding chair. I stood there for a long time. Something about it made me feel worse, not better, like I was seeing the leftovers of something I wasn't supposed to find. I turned around and left without touching anything. By the afternoon, I was feeling dizzy. My water filter was still working, but I hadn't eaten more than a few bites in almost 24 hours. My nerves were shot. Every little sound made me stop and listen. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I looked, nothing was there. Other times I smelled with smoke, faint and thin, like someone had a fire burning far away, but I never saw smoke. I found a small stream and followed it downhill. That's usually a good move when you're lost. Follow water, find people. But the forest kept getting denser, and the light barely came through the trees. My map was useless now. The stream twisted and forked and disappeared into thick underbrush. At one point, I slipped and fell hard on my side, cracking my elbow on a rock. I lay there for a while, gritting my teeth. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I didn't bother with the bivvy sack. I just sat against a tree with my knees to my chest, shivering. Something moved in the trees again. Not close, but always there. It circled. It stopped. It moved again. I couldn't tell if it was one animal or several. My mind started playing tricks on me, thinking I saw shadows that weren't there, imagining breathing sounds that stopped when I held mine. The next morning, I almost gave up. I stood there holding my pack, unsure which way to go. Then I made a decision, go west, straight west. That would eventually take me to a road. Even if I missed the trail, I'd hit a fire road or a logging road or something. By early afternoon, I started to see signs of human activity again. An old fence post, a strip of orange tape tied to a branch, a beer bottle with a faded label, then a logging road, full of ruts and weeds, but definitely a road. I walked it for hours, dragging my feet, until I saw tire tracks, then a plastic bag, then a cigarette butt. By sunset, I stumbled out onto a gravel road with a Forest Service sign half fallen over. I didn't recognize it, but I knew I was out. I kept walking. Just before it got totally dark, a pickup truck came around the corner, and the driver stopped when he saw me. I waved weakly, and he rolled down the window. I didn't say anything. I just pointed behind me, toward the trees. The ending. I ended up in the hospital for dehydration and exhaustion. The man who picked me up had a satellite phone and called the authorities. They airlifted. I had been planning this hiking trip for over 3 months. My job had been stressful, and I was starting to feel like everything in my life was getting too fast, too loud, too crowded. I live in a small apartment in a busy city, and I barely get to see the sky. Between work, traffic, noise, and people everywhere, I needed space. I needed quiet. That's why I picked the kind of place where cell signals don't reach, and where you can walk all day without seeing another human. It was supposed to be a 3-day solo hike through the northern section of the State Forest Preserve. I had done a lot of reading about it. It wasn't an official trail. It was one of those routes shared in niche forums and hiking groups, where experienced hikers post maps and tips for going off the marked paths. That's what I wanted. Something off-grid. Something that felt like I was away from everything. I started on a Friday morning. I parked my car at a gravel pull-off near the edge of the woods, where the road ended. I had my large hiking pack with me: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 4 days just in case, a water filtration system, spare socks, a knife, and a first aid kit. I had checked the weather forecast 3 times. No rain, cool nights, sunny days. I left a note with a friend telling her where I was going and when I'd be back. I thought I was being responsible. The trail started off beautiful. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and the leaves rustled with the lightest wind. There were no other cars at the pull-off, which made me feel good. I had the forest to myself. The first few hours were easy. The terrain was soft and mostly flat with gentle inclines. I had a printed topographic map with me and a compass. I had practiced navigation, and I wasn't too far from the river that cut through the area, so I had a reliable water source nearby. By the time I reached a small clearing near the river that afternoon, I had already walked about 8 miles. I set up my tent near the edge of the trees and made myself a simple meal. Just rice and dried vegetables with some powdered broth. I sat by the river afterward, listening to the sound of the water moving across the rocks. The peace I had been looking for was finally there. That night was quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling of the tent for a long time, just thinking. It was strange how quiet the world became when there were no engines, no buzzing of electricity, no people talking, just the chirping of insects and an occasional splash from the river. I slept well. The next morning I woke up early. I boiled some water for coffee, packed up camp, and started hiking north. My plan was to follow a ridgeline to a lookout point a few miles away and camp near there. I kept checking my map every 30 minutes, making sure I was on the right bearing. The forest here was denser. The trees were older. The ground was uneven, with patches of loose rock and some steep sections that made the hike harder. Around midday, I came across what looked like an old logging trail. It wasn't on the map, but I could see the signs: broken stumps, even spacing, and a faint path where the ground had been compacted years ago. It was going in roughly the same direction I wanted to go, so I followed it for a while. The walking was easier on that path. After maybe an hour of following it, I came across a small structure. It was deep in the woods, not visible from any aerial maps I had seen online. It looked like an old hunting cabin, half-collapsed, wooden frame, roof caved in on one side. There were no signs of recent use. It gave me a weird feeling in my chest, not because it looked haunted or anything like that, but just because I wasn't expecting to see it. I kept moving. I left the old logging trail shortly after, realizing it was taking me too far west. I had to climb up a steep hill covered in loose soil and exposed roots. That climb wore me out. I was sweating through my shirt and my legs were starting to ache. At the top, I stopped to rest and drink some water. That's when I heard something. It wasn't a loud noise, just a small cracking sound, like a twig snapping. It was far off, maybe 30 or 40 yards behind me and to the right. I scanned the trees but didn't see anything. I wasn't immediately alarmed. Wildlife was common here. Deer, squirrels, maybe a bear if I was really unlucky. I kept going. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. Another faint snapping of branches, this time a bit closer. I stopped walking and stood completely still. I held my breath. Everything was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then I heard a different sound. Not a crack. It was more like the crunch of a boot on dry leaves. That's when something in my body changed. It was like every instinct I had suddenly lit up. My breathing got shallow. My hands started to sweat. I turned around and stared back the way I had come. Nothing. No movement. No sound. But I didn't feel alone anymore. I moved faster now. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe even another hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I kept looking over my shoulder every few steps. Around 4 p.m., I reached the ridge and found a good spot to make camp. The view was beautiful, but I couldn't enjoy it. I kept hearing sounds in the woods, faint steps, branches moving. Sometimes I thought I saw movement behind the trees, but it was always gone when I looked directly at it. I set up camp quickly. I didn't eat much. My appetite was gone. I sat by a small fire, facing the woods, ears straining for every sound. The forest felt wrong now, like it was watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction I had hiked from. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath. The steps didn't move. They just stopped there. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves, like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. After a few minutes, the sound moved away, back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I packed up everything and started hiking back the way I came. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I just walked, fast and quiet, checking behind me every few minutes. I knew something had followed me, and I didn't want to find out what, but I got lost. Somewhere near the old logging trail, I took a wrong turn. Everything looked different. I kept checking my compass, but the terrain didn't match the map anymore. My legs were starting to shake. My mouth was dry even though I was drinking water. I was beginning to panic. Then I saw something. A small piece of torn blue fabric caught on a branch. I recognized it. It was from the rain jacket I had strapped to the side of my pack yesterday. That was impossible. I hadn't walked through this section before. I was going in circles. I forced myself to stop, sit down, and calm my breathing. I got the map and compass out again and spent 20 minutes figuring out where I had gone wrong. I backtracked slowly and carefully. Eventually, I found the river. It was the same river from my first camp. That meant I was only about 8 miles from my car. I could make it before nightfall if I kept moving. But something was still wrong. I saw more pieces of torn fabric, a bit of nylon, a shoelace, even an empty granola wrapper I recognized from my own food bag. Someone had gone through my pack. At that point, I broke into a full sprint. I didn't care about being quiet. I just wanted out. My legs were burning, my lungs were screaming, but I didn't stop. I kept imagining someone walking just out of sight, watching, waiting. By the time I saw the gravel road and my car, I nearly collapsed. I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there shaking, drenched in sweat, staring at the tree lean. I didn't see anyone, not then. But as I started the car and turned it around, I looked in the rearview mirror. Just for a second, at the very edge of the trees, I thought I saw a man, standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't stop driving until I got home. I didn't tell anyone what really happened. Not the police, not the friend who checked in on me. I just said I got lost and came home early. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the locks, kept waking up at the smallest sound. I had dreams about footsteps outside my tent. I haven't been hiking since, and I don't think I ever will again. I was 28 years old when I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. It was during early autumn, and I had taken a full week off work, planning to spend it away from the city, away from people, and completely alone in the wilderness. I needed a reset. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I didn't want to see people, hear traffic, or answer texts. I just wanted trees, hills, the sound of wind, and the ground under my boots. The plan was simple. I had researched a trail that wasn't extremely popular but still had some maintained paths. It was located in a national forest a few hours away from my apartment. It was supposed to be quiet, scenic, and peaceful. I read online that a few people backpack there each year, but it wasn't a busy place like the national parks. I figured I might not run into anyone the whole time, and that sounded perfect to me. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, clothes for all temperatures, food for a week, a small camp stove, matches, a GPS, 2 external phone batteries, a good knife, and a heavy-duty first aid kit. I had hiked a lot in the past, but never alone for this long, and never that deep into the forest. I made sure my gear was reliable. I even bought a new pair of waterproof boots. I drove out early Monday morning. The trailhead parking lot was almost empty when I arrived. Just one other car there, a dark green SUV with some mud on the tires. I took note of the plates and snapped a quick photo of the car, something I always did just in case. I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else was out there for the same reason as me. I locked up my car, threw on my backpack, and started walking. The trail was narrow, and the forest was thick with tall pines and oak trees. The air was cool and quiet. There was no trash, no people talking, no planes flying overhead. Just leaves under my boots, wind through the branches, and the occasional bird call. I felt better already. That first day was uneventful. I walked for hours, taking it slow, stopping to take pictures or drink water. I found a flat area near a creek to set up my tent before sunset. The ground was dry, and the forest around me was dense enough to block wind, but open enough to not feel claustrophobic. I cooked a small dinner on my stove and ate sitting on a log, watching the sun go down behind the trees. It was exactly what I had hoped for. That night I slept well. It got cold, but my bag kept me warm. I woke up only once to pee, and the forest was dead quiet. Not even crickets. It was a little eerie, but I chalked it up to the temperature. The second day, I kept hiking deeper into the forest. My plan was to keep going for 4 days, then turn around and take 3 to get back. I didn't want to be rushed. The trail markers were still visible, though they were more spaced out. There were fallen logs and overgrown sections that slowed me down, but I didn't mind. I wanted it to feel wild. That afternoon, I saw something strange. It wasn't a person or an animal. It was just a pile of rocks. Not huge, but not natural looking either. It was maybe 2 feet high, stacked carefully, and right in the middle of the trail. There were sticks jammed into the top, almost like antennas. I stopped and stared at it for a while. It wasn't scary, just odd. I thought maybe someone else hiking had made it as a marker or for fun. I stepped around it and kept moving. But then I saw another one later that day. That one was taller, with little animal bones tied to the sticks at the top. It looked fresh, like it hadn't been rained on or knocked over. And it wasn't near anything special. Just another random spot on the trail. That one bothered me. It didn't feel like a playful thing anymore. It felt intentional in a different way. I didn't stop to study it. I just moved past it and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had crept in. I camped a little earlier that night. I picked a spot away from the trail, behind a hill and surrounded by thick bushes. I didn't light a fire, just ate quickly and climbed into my sleeping bag. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. I kept hearing twigs snapping in the distance. I told myself it was deer or raccoons, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like slow footsteps, not fast, not darting around like animals do. Just 1 or 2 steps, then silence. Then again, then nothing. It happened maybe 3 or 4 times. Always far off, never near my tent. But it kept me awake for hours. I had my knife in my hand inside the bag, just in case. When I finally dozed off, it was almost morning. I considered turning back the next day. I really did, but I told myself I was overreacting. The piles of rocks were weird, but not dangerous, and I hadn't seen any sign of other people. I told myself the sounds were probably from animals stepping on dry branches, so I kept going. By the 3rd day, the trail was hard to follow. The trees grew closer together, and fallen logs were everywhere. I had to use my GPS just to make sure I was on the right path. The markers were almost gone. I wasn't completely lost, but I had to check the GPS constantly to stay on course. That afternoon, something happened that I couldn't explain. I found a clearing. A wide one, like someone had chopped down a large number of trees a long time ago. It wasn't a meadow. It was rough, uneven ground with broken stumps and black soil. In the middle of it was an old, rusted metal drum. It looked like a barrel used for burning trash. And beside it, almost buried in the dirt, was a boot. A single boot, half sunken, with the sole sticking up and the laces covered in mud. It was old, but not rotted. The leather was still intact. It looked out of place. I stared at it for a long time, my heart thudding. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to get closer to the barrel either. I don't know why. I just stood there and stared for maybe a full minute before backing away slowly and returning to the trail. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. I stopped enjoying the silence. I kept looking behind me every couple minutes. Every sound made me freeze and listen. I hiked until my legs ached and set up camp in a new spot, far from any clearings or strange landmarks. I didn't sleep much that night either. More footsteps in the distance, this time closer. By the fourth day, I knew I wasn't alone. I found footprints on the trail. Not mine, bigger than mine, wider, barefoot. I wear a size 11, and these were easily larger, pressed deep into the damp ground. There were no toe marks, which I found strange. Just the pad and heel, like someone or something walked flat-footed and heavy. I kept moving faster, my eyes scanning the woods constantly. I didn't eat lunch. I just drank water and kept going. I told myself to make it through the day and I'd turn around tomorrow. I had enough food and battery life to make it out. But that evening, something happened that changed everything. I had set up my tent again, this time on a narrow ridge overlooking a stream. It wasn't a perfect spot, but I was tired and didn't care anymore. I kept the knife next to me again, and my phone in my hand. Just before sunset, I stepped away from the tent to relieve myself and stretch my legs. I walked maybe 30 feet into the trees. When I came back, my tent was gone. At first I thought I had gotten turned around, like maybe I walked in the wrong direction. But the ridge was the same, the trees were the same. The rocks I used to mark the corners of the tent were still there. But the tent, my sleeping bag, my pack, everything was gone. My stomach dropped. My chest tightened. I spun in place, looking around wildly. Nothing. Not a sound. No rustling. No footsteps. No movement. Just empty woods and fading light. I couldn't think straight. I walked in circles, checking every side of the ridge. Nothing. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no gear, no shelter, and only my knife and phone in my pockets. I checked my GPS. It worked. Battery was down to 30%. I marked my position, picked a direction, and started moving fast. I walked until it was completely dark. My flashlight was in my pack, gone. I used my phone light sparingly. I didn't want to kill the battery. Every shadow looked like a person. Every tree looked like it was watching me. I didn't stop that night. I kept walking. Around 3 a.m., I sat down against a tree and rested my legs. I was shaking, not just from the cold, but from fear. I could hear noises all around me, breathing, maybe whispers or wind. I couldn't tell anymore. I was exhausted, scared, and losing my grip. Just before dawn, I found another pile of rocks. This one was different. It had my tent stakes in it. I started running. I don't remember most of that 5th day. I was delirious from no sleep. I followed the GPS like it was a lifeline. I ignored everything else. I walked until my knees buckled. I fell once and cut my hand on a rock. Blood soaked my sleeve, but I didn't stop. I knew I had to get back to the trailhead. That night, I slept curled under a tree, using my jacket as a blanket. I woke up once and saw movement in the trees. A shape, a human. I had been planning the solo hike for a while. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, but I usually stuck to familiar places. This time, I wanted to try something new. I found a remote trail in the northern part of the state, a few hours away from home. It wasn't a popular spot, which is exactly what attracted me to it. No crowds, no noise, no phones buzzing. Just the woods, my backpack, and my thoughts. The trail was called Pine Hollow Loop, a circular path that was supposed to be about 18 miles in total. It was described online as lightly trafficked and moderately difficult, with some steep climbs and dense forest along the way. Most people said it was best done in 2 days with a night of camping in the middle. I figured I'd be fine. I had camped dozens of times before. I was fit and I packed everything I needed: a small tent, food, water, GPS, first aid kit, flashlight, rain gear, knife, and extra clothes. I also carried a small notebook where I liked to write things down during long hikes. I left early in the morning to beat the heat. The drive up took about 3.5 hours. As I turned off the main highway and onto the gravel road leading to the trailhead, I noticed how quiet everything got. No houses, no gas stations, no signs of people, really, just endless trees and the hum of insects. I parked at a small clearing where a faded wooden sign marked the start of the loop. No other cars were there. I locked my car, threw my pack on, and stepped onto the trail. It was cool in the shade, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and I could hear the faint rustle of wind in the treetops. For the first couple of miles, it felt peaceful. The trail was narrow, mostly dirt with patches of mud where the morning dew hadn't dried yet. I had to duck under a few fallen branches and step over roots, but it wasn't anything difficult. Around midday, I stopped by a small stream to eat. I took off my boots and soaked my feet in the cold water. I checked my map and estimated I'd reach the halfway point around 4 p.m. That would give me time to set up camp before dark. Everything was going according to plan. I didn't see a single person all morning, which didn't bother me at all. That's what I wanted: silence, nature, and time to think. By 3:30 p.m., the trail started climbing. The incline wasn't too bad, but my legs were getting tired. I was sweating through my shirt, and flies buzzed around my face every time I slowed down. The trees grew thicker here. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy, and everything had a darker, damp feel. The forest floor was covered in ferns and moss, and the path narrowed until it felt more like a game trail than a real hiking route. I looked around and realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I stopped, took off my pack, and checked the GPS. The signal was weak. The dot showed me slightly off course, but not by much. Maybe 200 yards. I figured I must have missed a fork. I decided to backtrack a little to find it. I walked about 10 minutes before I realized I wasn't seeing anything familiar. There were no markers, no signs, and even the trail I thought I had been following didn't look like much of a trail anymore. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. I took out my compass and tried to reorient myself. According to the map, the trail looped east at that point. If I kept heading northeast, I should intersect it again. Seemed easy enough, but it wasn't. After another 20 minutes of pushing through thick underbrush, I came across what looked like a dry creek bed. I thought maybe it was a feature on the map I could use to guide myself. I followed it for a while, hoping it would lead me back to the main path. Didn't. The ground grew steeper and the brush got denser. It felt like every step forward took more energy. By the time I stopped again to catch my breath, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. Everything was quieter now, too quiet. Even the birds were gone. I checked my GPS again. No signal. That's when the panic started to set in. I was lost, completely turned around. I had enough daylight left to try finding a place to camp, but the fear of being lost out here, alone without signal, crawled into the back of my mind and sat there like a weight. I tried to stay calm. I picked the flattest spot I could find, cleared the ground, and set up my tent. I forced myself to eat even though I wasn't hungry. I boiled some water and made tea just to feel warm. I didn't write in my notebook that night. I just sat there with my flashlight and listened. At one point, I heard movement in the woods. Slow, steady crunches of leaves. I held my breath. It didn't sound like a deer or something small. It was heavy, measured. Then it stopped. I sat frozen in place for at least 15 minutes, waiting to hear it again. Nothing, just the sound of my heart in my ears and a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I slept badly that night. Every noise jerked me awake. At some point, I must have dozed off, but it didn't feel like sleep. It felt like waiting for something. The next morning, I packed up as fast as I could. My goal now was simple: find the trail. Find any marker, even a footprint. I followed the sun east, hoping I could loop back toward the car if I covered enough ground. The woods were thick and unkind. I fell once, scraped my leg, and had to stop to clean the cut. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my hands were scratched from pushing through branches. By late afternoon, I hadn't found the trail, but I did find something else. A shirt. It was torn, dirty, and hanging from a branch. At first I thought it was just trash, but it looked like it had been placed there. Nearby, I found an old boot, partly buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there a long time. I felt my stomach tighten. I looked around and didn't see any signs of a person, just silence and trees. I picked up the shirt, looked at it, and dropped it. I didn't want to stay there. I walked faster now, no longer thinking about the direction. I just wanted to put distance between me and that spot. Around 6 p.m., I found a clearing with an old fire pit. Just stones in a circle, long cold. Maybe someone had camped there months ago. I considered staying there for the night, but the feeling in my gut told me to keep going. That's when I saw the rope. It was tied between two trees, about waist height. A thin, frayed nylon rope, like something from a tarp or a clothesline. Hanging from it were strips of fabric, some old, some newer, like someone had tied rags to it. Maybe for fun or maybe as a marker. I didn't know, but it felt wrong. There was no logic in it, just instinct. Something in my body told me not to touch it, not to follow it. So I turned and walked the other way. That night, I barely slept. I kept the knife in my hand, flashlight ready, ears alert to every sound. Around midnight, I heard something move outside my tent. It wasn't fast. It was a slow step, then another, then a pause. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The footsteps circled once, maybe twice, then faded. I never saw what it was. When dawn finally broke, I didn't even cook breakfast. I just packed up and kept walking. My water was getting low. My food too. My body ached. My ankles were sore, and I had started talking to myself. Not out loud, but inside my head. Little phrases over and over. Asterisk, you're okay. Keep going. Find the trail. Find the road. Asterisk. I walked for hours that day. Around 3 p.m., I heard something I hadn't heard in 2 days. The sound of an engine. I froze and listened. Faint, distant, but definitely a vehicle. I scrambled toward the sound, crashing through bushes, not caring anymore about scratches or direction. I climbed a hill, and when I got to the top, I saw it. A dirt road. It wasn't the same one I had driven in on, but it was a road. I stumbled down the hill and followed it for nearly 2 hours before I saw a mailbox, an actual sign of life. Then a house. I knocked on the door, and a man answered. I didn't explain much. I just asked for help. He gave me water and let me call for assistance. Later, I found out I had gone nearly 14 miles off the original trail, deep into an unmarked section of woods that hadn't been maintained in decades. The area where I saw the rope and rags. The local sheriff said there had been reports of strange camps there over the years. Not illegal, just odd. People passing through. Squatters. Maybe. One time, someone went missing and was never found. They said I was lucky. I think about that hike a lot. About the rope, the footsteps, the torn shirt. I still hike, but I stick to well-known trails now. And I never go alone anymore. Some places just don't want you there. I decided to take a week off from everything and go on a solo hiking trip. I had been working every single day for months, staring at screens, barely sleeping right, and feeling like I was just on autopilot. I needed to reset. I didn't want beaches, people, or noise. I wanted to feel small again. I wanted to feel quiet. I chose a less popular trail in the northern part of the state, where old forest fires had scared most hikers away for years. A place people avoided now, even though it had reopened for public access. I figured it would give me space, peace, and maybe even some perspective. The trail was known as the Ashridge Loop, about 42 miles total, and I planned to do it in 4 days, giving myself 1 extra day in case things slowed down. I packed everything I thought I would need: my tent, sleeping bag, a detailed topographic map, compass, GPS device, bear spray, emergency radio, headlamp, food, water filter, first aid kit, extra clothes, power banks, and some duct tape wrapped around my lighter just in case. I made sure my boots were broken in. I double-checked the weather clear all week. I started early in the morning, parked my car in the gravel lot at the southern trailhead, logged my name into the trail register, and stepped onto the path. The sun was warm, the air had that clean pine smell, and everything felt light. I moved fast for the first few hours, covering ground quickly through the more alive sections of forest. But I knew what was coming. By late afternoon, I entered the burned zone. It was strange, no birds, no animal sounds. Just the sound of my boots on the ground and the wind moving through dead trees. They stood like skeletons, blackened and charred. Some had fallen, and some were still standing, thin and fragile, like if you sneezed too hard, they might fall over. The forest floor was dry and covered in ash and dust. Even though the fire had happened years ago, it still looked like the aftermath of something recent. The smell of burnt wood was faint but always there. I set up camp that first night on a small ridge above the trail, far enough from any dead trees that could fall on me. I was careful. I made sure my tent was staked into the packed soil, laid out my gear neatly, and kept my food sealed and away from the tent. I lay down as the sky turned orange and listened to the dead silence. The first night passed without trouble. The second day, the trail got harder to follow. The fire had destroyed most of the markers and signs, and even some sections of the trail had been covered by fallen trees or overgrown with young plants trying to grow back. I had to check my map constantly. I started noticing small things that I didn't like. Animal prints I didn't recognize, more bear scat than I was used to seeing, and strange drag marks across the trail, like something big had been pulled across the dirt. I told myself it was probably a deer killed by a mountain lion. That was normal. I kept moving. Around noon, I heard something crash through the brush below me. I froze and waited, but saw nothing. Then again, maybe I didn't want to see anything. I picked up the pace. I checked my GPS. It worked fine, still tracking the trail ahead. But by late afternoon, the trail vanished, just gone. There were too many fallen trees and no clear path anymore. I pulled out the map, turned circles trying to match the contours of the hills around me to the lines on the paper, but it wasn't helping. The compass still pointed north, but the trail was gone, and so was any sign of other hikers. My GPS kept flashing the trail line, but the actual ground didn't match it anymore. I tried to backtrack, but everything looked the same in the burn zone. No landmarks, no real trees, just black trunks, gray dirt, and sky. I told myself not to panic. I found a flat patch and set up camp again. I rationed my food just in case. I made a note of the last spot where the trail had been visible and planned to try a wider search in the morning. That night, I heard something move around my tent. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag. No lights, no noise, just listening. Heavy, slow steps, twigs snapping, then nothing. The next morning, I walked in wide circles from camp, trying to relocate the trail. I marked each direction I searched with small piles of rocks so I wouldn't double back. I did this for hours. Still nothing. I kept looking. Around noon, I climbed a low hill to get a better view, and I saw smoke far in the distance. It was thin, small, like a campfire. Person, or at least I hoped it was. I packed up my gear and headed toward it. It was farther than I thought, maybe 3 or 4 miles, but I could see the smoke clearly as the sun lowered. I walked until dusk. The smoke disappeared just as I reached the hill where I thought it was coming from. I found nothing. No fire, no camp. Just a large patch of disturbed ground, trampled and dirty like someone had been there and left quickly. Some boot prints. Drag marks again. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the headlamp on low, bear spray in my hand, and sat up most of the night listening. No steps this time, just wind and the sound of trees creaking. The 4th day, I ran out of water. I found a stream, barely moving, but it was water. I filtered it carefully, drank slowly, and filled my bottles. I started walking again, following the slope of the land downhill, hoping to find a fire road or sign of civilization. I knew that the farther down I went, the more likely I'd hit a forest road or river. But instead, I found a ravine. It was steep and wide and full of tangled branches and deadfall. The sides were too steep to cross easily, but I needed to get to the other side to keep following the terrain. So I decided to follow the ravine instead, hoping it would lead to something. That was a mistake. The ravine got deeper, rockier, and more dangerous. The walls narrowed. I slipped twice, cut my hands open trying to catch myself. I had no signal. My GPS showed nothing now, just blank space and an arrow. I was off the map. I stopped to rest and eat a protein bar. That's when I noticed the buzzards. 3 of them circling above. I followed the direction they circled, and not far ahead I found what they were after, a dead animal. At first I thought it was a deer, but the body was torn apart beyond recognition. Ribs, legs, and pieces of flesh were scattered. Some of the meat looked fresh, no smell yet, which meant it had happened very recently. Too recently. I started moving again, faster now. I didn't care about keeping a straight line. I just needed to get out. That night, I made a small fire. I broke my own rule and camped between 2 dead trees, just because the ground was flatter. I was shaking from exhaustion, every muscle sore. My knees hurt, my lips were cracked, and I couldn't stop thinking about that dead animal. I woke up sometime before dawn because something was breathing near me. Not steps, breathing. I didn't move. My fire had burned low, only embers now. The breathing was slow, heavy, coming from just outside the tent. Then I heard it move away. It was heavy, more than a person, but slower than a bear. I waited for an hour before I opened the tent. I didn't see anything, just the remains of the fire and tracks in the ash. Big tracks, too big. I packed and moved before the sun came up. That day, I didn't even try to find a trail. I just went downhill through brush, rocks, ash, and whatever else. My clothes were filthy, legs scraped, and I was out of food now. I ate the last energy gel I had and kept walking. I passed another dead animal, smaller this time, maybe a raccoon. Same thing, torn apart, no sign of scavenging. By sunset, I found something strange. A cabin, old, burned out, roof half gone. But it was real. I walked slowly toward it, every step echoing in the silence. The door was gone, the inside empty, just a frame of what it used to be. But someone had been there. There were new footprints in the ash leading in and out, and worse, scratches on the walls. Not animal scratches. Straight, thin, almost like carved lines. Tall too. Taller than I could reach without standing on something. I stayed for only 5 minutes. Then I walked fast until it got dark again. That night, I didn't make a fire. I just curled up in my sleeping bag and lay still. At some point, I must have passed out. The next morning, I saw a bird, a real bird, sitting on a stump, looking at me. That meant I was close to living forest again. I got up, followed the direction it had flown, and by noon, the burn zone ended. Green trees, underbrush, birdsong. It was like walking into another world. I almost cried. 2 hours later, I hit a dirt road, a service road. I followed it until I found tire tracks and eventually came across a parked pickup. No one was in it, but I waited, and a few hours later a guy showed up with chainsaws in his truck bed, part of a trail maintenance crew. He looked at me like I had come back from the dead. He gave me water, a granola bar, and drove me all the way back to the ranger station. They told me I had wandered 19 miles off course. I had crossed into a restricted part of the forest that was still considered unsafe because of unstable terrain and wildlife.